Hello, this is Alex Birkett, and you're listening to the Long Game Podcast. In this episode, I'm talking to Ryan Law. Ryan is the director of marketing at Animalz, a content marketing agency, and he's also a published author and musician. Ryan is well known for his thought leadership and strong voice in the content marketing space, penning articles on topics like copycat content and how to differentiate your content in crowded spaces, second mover advantage, and why you shouldn't necessarily try to copy the HubSpot content marketing approach, and how to build a diversified content portfolio. In fact, Ryan is so good at writing this type of thought leadership that he recently gave an incredibly popular talk on how to craft content like this for the Winter Games. You can find it on YouTube. It's titled How to Turn Wild Opinions into Traffic, Backlinks, and Social Proof, and I highly recommend you watch it after you listen to this podcast, of course. Because in this conversation, we cover how Ryan finds time to write novels and record albums while doing content marketing full-time, whether he plans or improvs when it comes to the creative process in each of these endeavors, and functional tips for companies who are looking to produce better content to stop relying on Me Too, similar search-driven 500-word pieces and break out of the mold and differentiate and create truly memorable content. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Ryan Law. Yeah. Can you actually, can you talk about how you came to be the director of marketing at Animalz? And then, I know you founded an agency before, but what was your path up to this point like?
Yeah, so when I joined Animalz, I joined in our core writing role, basically. At the time, I was a bit paranoid that my career path had been so unconventional that I just wasn't hireable anywhere, basically. And I applied to 60 companies, and Animalz happened to be the one that got back to me fastest with a job offer. So I joined, I just wrote loads and loads, churning out content marketing for a bunch of our customers. I'm the kind of person that gets bored very easily and likes trying to help out with the hardest problems I can find in a company. So I got a chance to become a content strategist, basically built out a team underneath me, which was amazing, worked with 10 or so writers and editors. Enjoyed that, but also got a bit bored of that. And when Jimmy left to go and found Superpath, go off and do his amazing entrepreneurial thing, I got a chance to take over as director of marketing. And yeah, I've been doing that for just over a year now.
So in terms of the director of marketing role, is that just kind of you own all of the lead flow in and kind of the MQLs, SQLs, and whatever channel you can use to sort of attract those is fair game? Or how does that position kind of work at Animalz?
Yeah, exactly that. I basically am accountable for SQLs. That's the thing that matters. That's the thing that I care about. And we are a team of one in terms of marketing. We've got Andrew, who's our head of R&D, who's kind of marketing adjacent and building amazing products, which do a lot of marketing for us. But in terms of day-to-day execution, it's as much as I can do. The rest of the team's really busy creating stuff for our customers. And obviously we bias towards content in terms of the acquisition channels we use, because as well as getting people to the website, I think our content plays a really important role as social proof for our company as well. It should really be a showcase of the best that we can do, so that people, even if it's not the right strategy for their SaaS company, because they're a different model, different stage of growth or whatever, it should be inspirational. They should learn a lot from it.
So yeah, the Animalz content that you guys put out on the blog is famous. You guys have great thought leadership, and you write a lot of it. Your byline is on a ton of these pieces. Is it all you writing this right now, or do you have a team that you work with internally that can do these from time to time, or I don't know, is this all you, or are you working with other people to kind of accomplish this?
Yeah, so it's unfortunately about 90% me.
Wow.
When I tried to take over, one of my big goals was, we've got literally 80 people at the moment, and they are all obsessed with content. They all think about it as deeply as you can imagine. And I wanted to elevate as many of their voices as possible. But a lot of the time, they're just very, very busy, and it's hard to create content for the blog. Classic, cobbler's shoes situation. Mm-hmm. But I do a lot of stuff where I talk to our team or interview them, or sometimes ghostwrite for them as well to help them get their ideas out into the world. Because I think we've probably got enough of as you say, my face on the blog already, enough of Jimmy's face. I want to start getting some new blood onto the blog a little bit more if I can.
Outside of the blog, I know you have a podcast. Do you have any other channels that sort of either synergize with the content that you're putting out or act as other forms of acquisition? Or yeah, what other distribution channels are you guys looking into for, getting new clients?
Yeah, so a huge amount of our new customers come from referral, and that's primarily through our network. Like we've worked with so many companies that we're kind of recommended in lots of the like VC communities and that kind of thing. So that's a big referral community for us. As well, Jimmy's obviously created Superpath, and there are a few like professional community groups that are full of content marketers, people that love like sharing our content and sharing ideas for it as well. So that's huge. Emo distribution as well. Something we do with a lot of customers is we actually reach out to the biggest newsletters we can find in their industry, because it's such a high leverage thing to do. For the sake of a single email, you've got all these newsletter curators that are so hungry for content, and if you create something that's good, they're incentivized to share it every week. So yeah, there's maybe a rotation of 15 to 20 newsletters that feature our content. That drives a big load of traffic to us as well. And Twitter is surprisingly good, even for business as well. It's a great channel for that.
Do you guys have an actual centralized strategy for Twitter? Or is it just kind of like you guys all have your own Twitter accounts and it's like a decentralized, like just build up the personal brand and hopefully people will come in through those single avenues?
Yeah, totally decentralized, kind of serendipitous benefit to Animalz. I do run, in inverted commas, the Animalz brand account, but I don't have much time to do a very good job for it. And I'd almost rather have it be a little bit quiet than do a bad job at it. So yeah, largely personal brands.
That's cool. And I think that benefits because you guys have like a large amount of employees and it seems like many of them are active on Twitter. That's something that at Omniscient we've tried to do more is like we've gotten leads through LinkedIn posts, we've gotten leads through Twitter, but it's one of those things that it's so difficult to prioritize in your daily events and all the other things that are going on to just sit down and actually write like a LinkedIn post. So that's something that we've been trying to reflect on and figure out how we can get more leverage and how we can be more prolific there. And one way we've done that is actually just through, like, we do this monthly event now that we totally copied from Winter Games. Nice. So it's, the Omniscient office hours where we get like other speakers in and just like, then we have a bunch of fresh content we can learn from. And then podcasts like this. So essentially I have a conversation with you. I'm going to pull a bunch of ideas away. And that's just, it's almost like writers have to read, right? To kind of drink from the well of inspiration. And I feel like by doing these formats, like we actually get more insights that we can then go post on LinkedIn or Twitter in pursuit of distribution for these given channels, but also just in general, like once we've learned things. So I don't know.
I love that. And after I actually talked at the Winter Games, I immediately went away and thought, how can we copy this in some format as well? It was a great kind of almost like a mini like festival or something kind of community. So I immediately went away and did like a little webinar series, different order of magnitude of success compared to what Pep put together, but inspired by it nonetheless.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you guys have the podcast and you're primarily in charge of that. Are you running kind of every aspect of that, guest selection, prepping the interview, all of it, or what's your role in the podcast?
Yeah, at the moment, all of it as well. I think the blog, I've realized, is the core thing that we do. Like, given all my constraints, that's the thing I have to take the most time and energy over. And the blog started out as almost a way of capturing some of the byproduct of that. Originally, it was conversations between our team members about content. So it was a great way of like elaborating on some of the topics we talked about, a way of distilling them down into like an audio format that not everyone wants to read a 1,200 word blog post or whatever. And kind of stopped doing that because it's really hard to prove much of a return on that in terms of, how the downloads translate into new customers and that kind of thing. And increasingly, I'm just trying to connect to people that I think we can learn from that are doing very weird niche parts of content marketing. I talked to Blake Amal recently at Copy.ai about the role of AI in content, which is fascinating. Talked to Fio Desetto about product-led content, which was this beautiful framing of a topic I'd heard about, but like didn't have a nice, concise, defined definition. So just using that as a way to learn from peers and find discrete concepts that we can pull into our marketing as well. That's kind of how I'm approaching it at the moment.
We do the exact same thing. We look at it as like, all right, if there's any downloads and if there's any listeners and if there's any customers that come from that, wonderful. But if we just have a conversation that's worth having and we learn something, that's really where the benefit is. And like you said, you get to connect with all these cool and interesting people and have an excuse to talk to them for a couple hours. So it's like, It's like getting coffees at scale, you know?
Yeah, and you get, backlinks from it as well. Maybe they're incentivized to share it with their network. All these second order effects that come from just having conversations with people. I can see why, it seems to be a bit of a marketing tactic du jour these days.
100%. So you mentioned that you were worried before you joined Animalz that you had such an untraditional career path that you wouldn't get hired by anybody. What do you mean you had an untraditional career path? What did that look like?
So I went to university, as most people, especially in my peer group, did. I studied economics and sociology just because it was interesting to me. Like I enjoyed economics at school. I liked writing essays for some strange reason, and I went and applied and did that. And I got to the end of the 3 years there, and I saw these lists of like suitable career paths, and I thought, oh God, what have I done? It was finance for all economics people. It was like social work for the sociologists. None of which seemed to have any kind of bearing on the really interesting stuff we'd actually studied. There seemed to be no connection to it. So while I was actually at university, I got very sick of tending bar until 5 a.m. So I started just freelance blogging. Used some of these really terrible sites that at the time paid you like $2 or $3 per article. But, I was a cheap student and it paid for a few beers. So I did that. And when I stopped university, I just kept going, just literally sat in my bedroom at home at my parents' house for like 3 years and just cranked out dozens of blog posts every week. And as a result, I got to become quite a good content marketer at, quite early days when content marketing was a little bit novel and exciting as well. But I didn't have much in the way to validate that experience. I was just a guy with a really amateurishly made website. So yeah, when I left my last company, I thought, how am I actually going to get a job? And I panicked a bit. And it was, I don't know, I felt kind of lucky that Animalz made me an offer the way they did.
Mm. How did you know when you were in college? How did you know there was that opportunity, even though it was a small one, to write articles and get paid for it? Did you have any inspiration, or like, did you follow in anybody's footsteps, or how did you stumble upon that?
So I had my best friend at the time was one of the most entrepreneurial people I've ever met in my life. While we were at school together, he founded and sold a file storage platform pre-Dropbox, pre-Box, So he, as a teenager, he was just like on a different level, a different plane of existence compared to me and most other people. And as he was like learning that and growing that, he saw, a growing need for content for SEO in particular. He was a developer, as a lot of developers did. They started out as slightly black hat SEOs because that's largely what SEO was, 15, 20 years ago. But as he saw that wasn't that sustainable anymore. Lots of companies were getting dinged every time Google updated their algorithms. He thought content would be a really great thing to do. And he knew from school that I was a complete writing nerd and I spent, all my time writing at school. So he suggested, check out these websites, get started. And that was what got me hooked. His little nugget of inspiration right there.
That's cool. It's always interesting to me how this starts, because it does seem like there's sort of a domino like effect where you start writing, you figure out, oh, I can do this. Eventually you find opportunities where you can get paid more, or, you build leverage through a personal blog or something like that. So for me, it was, I read, Tim Ferriss and Ryan Holiday, and I had seen how they had built blogs. So when I was in college, I studied journalism, didn't know what I wanted to do, possibly get into tech and the marketing side. So I just started a blog where I would write about the things that I would learn in school, kind of the journalism lessons that would apply to marketing, stuff from my internship. And then that allowed me to start freelancing as well. I'm like, oh, hey, I can write. And I have this little portfolio, and I would get paid, super cheap rates for whatever articles. But I'm like, okay, this is an area that is interesting. People are willing to pay for it despite like low volume. And it's incredibly flexible. Like I can just choose my own adventure here. And as somebody who was always interested in freedom, that was such an interesting kind of allure of content marketing for me.
Yeah, I totally love that. And I remember like back when I was kind of building my own agency and starting to try and be a bit more serious about it, I remember reading some of your content as well from CXL and like a few other places. So it's cool to like all these years later actually like cross paths and we're still doing that same thing, still making a living out of it.
The CXL thing is weird. And actually, this is a good question for you too, because I feel like when I had my own blog, there was a couple hundred people that maybe read it. I'm trying to boost those numbers up now. I'm trying to build an actual blog. But back then it was very small. And then I worked for CXL and I was getting paid to essentially learn about A/B testing, get experience doing it, and then write about it. So I could build a personal brand and I was getting paid for it. And I had no intention or no idea how much leverage it would give me because of the reach, simply having the platform and like that CXL logo behind some of my writing. And obviously it's a, highly technical kind of, it's not like 500 word SEO posts, it's like good content. So people would read those. And I got tons of opportunities based on that. And I feel like Animalz, you guys have such an incredible distribution channel as well, where it seems like have a similar thing where you can essentially take all of these insights from your clients, from working in content, from your podcast and all this stuff, translate those to blog posts, and then you, while obviously helping Animalz, like you get some personal brand effects as well with your blogging.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing I struggled with the most when I was a bit younger is that content marketing, in almost all situations, a lot of it, especially agency side, is white label. You are writing wonderful, amazing content that somebody else fundamentally gets the credit for. So if you want to build a personal brand, you have to do that as a separate exercise, sometimes even outside of work. But there are situations like, I'm very lucky to be in the role I am now, where I could build the Animalz brand, and as a serendipitous side effect of that, I'm also building my personal brand as well, because my face is on this stuff. And it's kind of true throughout the company. Like, meta content has been such a staple of what we do and what we write about, just sharing our experiences and the learnings we have from our entire team and trying to consolidate that down into content. And that's something that I think even the busiest person can find time to do, is just write a little bit about their experiences and learnings and turn that into personal content.
I find it's a good exercise of documentation as well. Something I've recently begun doing. I've always had like a little email list, but I didn't really put any effort and energy into it. So I would just write random posts every once in a while. People would forget about it and be like, why is this guy emailing me?
Okay.
So I started doing a monthly thing, and it's got like a pretty particular format. So I do like the bully pulpit section, where I essentially write about, my opinions on random things. I have what I've been working on, sort of things I've published, and then things I've been consuming, articles, blog posts, podcasts, etc. And then what this does, it gives me content to like produce for my little audience. That's great. But then the other thing is like I cement my own learnings, because it gives me like proof of documentation. So as I'm going through all these things, as I'm thinking thoughts in the morning, I write them down. And I feel like that's a side benefit of some of this personal brand stuff too, is like for example, Pep is great on LinkedIn and Twitter. He's posting all the time. He emails himself these little insights. And I feel like that documentation process also allows him to kind of cement these things for his own career and for his own business building, and then simultaneously get the benefit of teaching others and them, being attracted to his platform as well.
I totally agree. And I really enjoy looking back through the last 50 posts we published on the Animalz blog, because you can actually see this evolution of idea happening throughout that. Because, often I'll have an idea and I'll write it, and it's kind of interesting and kind of useful. But then you sit with it, you get feedback from the people that have read it, you write other content, you actually do some of the things that you detailed in there, and your thinking evolves a little bit. Maybe it meshes with another idea you've written about. And quite often the articles we've written that have been really successful, really resonated, we've already written about them 10 times in some kind of earlier, more nascent format. But it's taken that long to kind of consolidate, sit with, learn from, process, and create that, more polished final state version of that idea. Writing is a great way of, consolidating as well as coming up with those original insights in the first place.
Where do you get the original insights? Where do the initial ideas for Animalz blog posts come from?
Well, I've actually written an entire blog post about this. I call it like the idea farm, because I think that was a really great way of trying to frame that. When I started out in content marketing, I thought your starting point was always keywords. That was it. You find something with good volume, that's the topic settled, that is an idea. And working at Animalz, I got that idea like quickly beaten out of me. It's one of many, many, many possible sources. So Jimmy, most famously, he got most of his ideas from sitting in the sales process. He would talk to people as they were buying, and hesitations or problems or concerns that would crop up, he would try and answer through content. That was amazing. I'm a really big fan of taking models from other disciplines and thinking, how does that apply to content? Is there something we can learn from that, some underlying universal principle? So I've started nerding out with this tool called Obsidian.md, which kind of like Roam Research, that kind of vibe. It's like a network note-taking tool. So every time I come across a cool model or a framework or a principle, I dump it in there and I try and build as many connections between it as I can. Try and think, how does that apply to content in particular? And that normally, ends up with stuff that's interesting as well as hopefully useful.
So you're just going across like the normal landscape of your learning journey. You're just learning about the things you want to learn anyway. And then you're thinking in analogies. You're like, all right, how can I pull this idea back to content marketing and make this actually useful in that context?
Trying to, yeah. And obviously, I can't escape the fact that I am still doing content marketing every day. So I still have all the exposure to customers, my work colleagues, my network. So there's always that undercurrent of continued engagement with content marketing. And it's that combination of the two, you can kind of mesh them together and see what pops out. Yeah, what are the underlying principles that you can apply?
Oh, I love this is how I think too in this kind of pattern-based format. I'm a dilettante. I like to just do a bunch of random shit. And I feel like my strength is kind of, synergizing, like bringing those things together and crossing the different kind of swim lanes. So I read quite a bit. And when I do now with nonfiction, I'm almost always in the back of my mind thinking like, how does this either apply to content marketing or to conversion rate optimization? Because those are kind of my two worlds. But I feel like when you get an initial idea in a field like economics, for example, this is one that we use, right? Like for our agency, we came up with the barbell strategy. So it's kind of a portfolio allocation model of like, you put 80% of your assets into like kind of like stable, predictable things. And for us, that would be something like SEO or keyword driven stuff or product led content. And then you keep 20% open where it's highly volatile. It's like basically you could have an extreme upside or you could, nothing could happen. And that's maybe our like buzzworthy, social share, contrarian kind of content. But it was like this initial idea that I got from reading Nassim Taleb. I'm like, oh, that's a cool way to actually do prioritization for like either experiments or for blog posts or really for anything and like kind of balance the risk reward ratio. So it's interesting. It sounds like you do something similar when you're just reading general nonfiction.
And that example as well, that makes me laugh so much because I wrote basically the same article, the same premise, but I'm always kicking myself because I didn't actually use the barbell terminology. That's so much pithier, so much more interesting, it's so much smarter. I talked about building like a balanced content portfolio, which is way less interesting. But yeah, same premise applies,
I feel like half the battle is finding that keyword, that trademark phrase, the Brian Dean skyscraper technique, right? It's just finding whatever that word is that people can remember.
Yeah, and I actually tried to come up with a process and write an article, and I actually talked about this in my winter talk, the idea of the coined concept. It's great to have like this model that applies and it's useful and interesting, but without some really catchy, pithy terminology to wrap it up in, to make it easy to share, it's probably going to fall flat on its face. Ideas are quite nebulous, quite hard to communicate, and you need something that's so stupidly simple and catchy that everyone's going to be talking about it. So as an exercise, I always try and do with new content, like what is the coined concept I can apply to this? You can pull it from related disciplines, film, cinema, economics, anywhere you like.
How do you think these are predictable in terms of like if they'll catch on or not? Because I found like I've tried to name a couple different things and they've petered out and didn't really catch on. And then some like the barbell, like people actually talk about that now and use that framework. So I do find that it's difficult to figure out which thing will be particularly catchy. Sometimes it just has a ring to it. Product-led content, for example, you're like, yeah, it's probably going to work. It's already using like the product-led growth thing. It's, more people are writing like product-focused content and going away from the old, like, I guess HubSpot used to do this with the, we write content to be educational, not to sell our product. And now people are like, oh, actually, we want to sell products too. But yeah, how do you find like the predictability, or like, are you getting better and better at choosing the particular coined phrase, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's probably just the kind of unspoken heuristics in your head where if you try and do it for every article, you gradually get a little bit better each time at finding stuff that does work. I think the most important thing is you're not trying to like labor a term onto an article at the end of the process. It needs to be like some metaphor, some analogy that is just a really great framing for explaining the topic in the first place. So actually that almost has to be the first thing you come up with. Like you've got a topic, like, you should have different types of content and that will yield different outcomes. You almost want to start with the barbell because working that theory throughout the article is so much more convincing than just slapping that in the title tag and that kind of thing. I guess one way you can reduce the risk of picking something that doesn't work is choose an already popular topic. Like, everyone loves barbell theory, and Nassim Taleb is like amazing at coming up with these like black swan, anti-fragile. So using that, appropriating that, and making a content marketing equivalent of that, probably a pretty solid choice.
What are some of the most popular ones that you guys have come up with that still resonate and people still use ubiquitously?
So the one Jimmy did, library versus publication, that gets used a lot.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's great. That's interesting because he just emailed his newsletter today was about him rethinking that because he doesn't necessarily think it works that well today. When I came up with copycat content as well, I was really happy with that. That was I see people using that terminology organically. It's not, I didn't invent those two words used together. I didn't even invent them using them in that context, but that article gave it like a new lease of life. And generally when people talk about that, it's because they've read that article and used that.
Interesting. Something you said made me think with Jimmy going back and rethinking his concept. You guys read a lot of contrarian articles in terms of like, you think, I guess this is what your talk was about, the wild opinions into backlinks and content and all that. Like you take a concept that is ubiquitous in the industry, something like all content should be SEO focused, and you rethink that, right? And do the, what is it? The synthesis,
thesis,
model?
antithesis, synthesis. Good old
Hegelian dialect.
Yeah.
So, but do you find, so this is something I was wondering, right? Like Jimmy may have went back on this a little bit and said, oh, actually, maybe there is something to the publication model. Do you think sometimes that the effectiveness of content marketing simply comes from that old like Tim Ferriss or Mark Twain thing where it's like, when you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to pause and reflect, right? If you just zag when people zig, like, do you think maybe there's some sort of like efficiency or effectiveness that comes from that? And like, there's this like pendulum that kind of swings back and forth with contrarian opinions like that.
Yeah. So as soon as it then does become popular, you have to zag again. Yeah.
Everybody else is doing it now. Everybody's doing it like a library. So now you're like, oh, actually publication time.
Yeah, I do think so. Like when I joined Animalz, the thing that struck me about their approach to content was they were doing the opposite of what I was doing at my marketing agency, what every other marketing agency I knew was doing, which was going as hard as they could on search content. Like I'd just come from writing 10,000 word articles on SaaS metrics and SaaS pricing. And I got to Animalz and like, they didn't even talk about keywords for their blog. It was like, what ideas are interesting? What stories can you tell? As a result, nobody else was doing that. And every time you read an Animalz article, it just lodged itself in your brain in a way that other content didn't, because nobody else was doing that. So yeah, maybe now as this style gets more popular, we're going to go really hard on the search content again.
Go back to the HubSpot model. I do think, I mean, with the content you guys produce, there is a moat built in, because I think it's pretty difficult to do this style of content. We did a podcast, kind of a kitchen side thing, where the founders of Omniscient all talk and just kind of discuss ideas between this idea of like hiring a writer and a subject matter expert and how those two work together. And in my opinion, content that is thought leadership and is contrarian in nature is very difficult to write if you don't have a background, a very like deep background in that subject. Like it's hard to write technical content about, let's say, A/B testing, but it's way harder, I think, to write something that takes a common industry trope and you take like a strong opinion in the opposite direction, because to even know what that trope is and to understand the nuance of that, you have to have such a kind of innate understanding of things. So I think there's a moat there, but also I wanted to ask how you do this at scale with your clients. Like, do you guys work with subject matter experts to pull those things like a journalist would? This is something that I struggle even for myself writing content like this. So I couldn't imagine, doing this for somebody else, or like kind of like applying my writer skills for somebody else's expertise.
Yeah, I love that point. Somebody I work with, Andrew, he clocked me onto this term shibboleths, which was a great way of like articulating this problem. Any community, whether you're writing for developers or HR managers or whatever, they have their own shibboleths, like these unique quirks and idiosyncrasies and shared values and ways of communicating that are unique to that community. Even if you can kind of intellectually grasp the subject you're writing about, working out what those shibboleths are is so hard. You can't really do it without being a part of that community. And quite often that's how a lot of that content fails that sniff test. It doesn't have those little hallmarks of validity that it should have. Maybe you'll spend too long talking about something which is just a truism. People just know it to be true. And because it's an epiphany for you, you overweight that in your writing. I think the way we overcome that is we just talk to the people that are subject matter experts. So much of our research for so many of these companies and customers is just interviewing people, finding people that have been doing this thing for 20 years, running ideas past them, getting them to review drafts, talking to them about like ideas that they think are interesting. And we become the ones that then try and distill that into functional content. In some cases, it's less about, learning the subject and more about becoming this conduit for other people's experience to come through in the article. And we do have a research team as well. So when we do have to learn stuff, having a team that can actually help you with that, that's their full-time job. That is absolute lifesaver as well.
Do you think like one question that comes up with the style of content, it's hard to replicate. So like there's a high quality bar, I think. So right, if you're able to write this stuff, like there's a huge benefit in that. But I wonder, it doesn't have the naturally embedded distribution channel that, search driven content does. SEO is one of the most predictable, month over month places that you can get traffic, and you can usually predict it down to the conversion rate of that given page, where there's a little bit more uncertainty around how this picks up steam. So how do you guys look at distribution when you're writing this stuff? And does that vary based on the company, if they already have an audience versus like, they're more starting from scratch? Or how do you get this content in front of people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reason most people are interested in content marketing is because of search traffic. The idea that you publish stuff and predictably it will compound over time. That's wonderful. With thought leadership content, that is a lot harder to do. Maybe the Animalz blog is a good example in the sense that you don't actually need to reach a lot of people if you are reaching the right people. And that is something that this type of content is much better at doing. So the kind of common logic of a lot of, unit economics of content marketing is let's reach 100,000 people and we'll close 100 deals out of that. I think you can actually be a lot more efficient with thought leadership content, because if you talk to people from the select community you want to reach, like VPs or directors of marketing or whatever that is, you're going to get a much better understanding of where they go for their information, the communities and channels they use and in which they share their content, the newsletters they care about. And quite often that is probably like the primary distribution channel we would use for that content. Thought leadership in particular, dark social is really important these days. WhatsApp groups, Telegram, Slack communities, Discords. If an article reaches those groups, maybe it'll rack up 100 views if you're lucky, but potentially that could be 10 really interested prospects because that community is just absolutely tailor-made. It's right for what you're trying to reach. We've always relied as well on owned newsletter channels as well. I'm a big believer in the idea that it's so hard to reach even one person with your content that if you're going to do that, you want to make sure that you do everything you can to keep them around and continue to engage them. So the Animalz newsletter today is one of our biggest drivers of repeatable traffic, because people care about the newsletter as well as the content. They kind of subscribe for that dual benefit.
It sounds like, there's a slow, long game component to this, because you write things people care about and eventually you do build up that owned audience. And in that case, like once you've gotten there, then the content becomes effective upon launch, and you don't have to like worry as much about how you get people's attention. But there's that part you mentioned about like dark social being kind of like a big thing, and there being kind of smaller samples, and like it sounded like less attribution, or it's not like a direct thing where they come in via a keyword. You can track that keyword down to the point where they convert, and then like track it down the funnel and get these very clear, measurable kind of metrics. Do you think that one, am I right that it's a little bit less measurable to do this style? And two, do you think that causes companies to shy away from it because there's not as much high level bird's eye clarity in terms of like what ROI they're getting from their content?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely, on both regards. Like our blog is a good example. From a traffic perspective, it kind of sucks. Like we don't actually get much traffic at all in the grand scheme of things. If I'd sat down and written an SEO article every day, we'd have like orders of magnitude more content than we actually do, more traffic. But the way we experience the success of that is through people mentioning our content during the sales process. They actually come to us and they say, I read this, it blew my mind. This articulated something I didn't even know I was worried about. Let's work together. Or people share it in online communities. People respond to our newsletter and say, oh my God, I can't believe This is this thing I've never heard of before. So the qualitative experience for like the sales team and for me as a marketer, we know the content is working. We have those kind of indicators. But you're totally right that if you are a slightly bigger company, maybe a SaaS company, it's kind of hard to make data-driven decisions based on just that qualitative data. But I'm not sure there's much of a way around that given technology at the moment. And there is definitely a competitive advantage to just going with your gut. I think there's a reason why lots of the companies that have legendary content marketing operations today, like Intercom or Stripe, they had early founding teams that just cared so much about sharing their ideas. They would post content regardless of whether it did anything or not. They had founders and early members that you couldn't stop publishing content. So they got through that initial hurdle of, oh, where's the ROI of this? Oh my God, it's not working. And they got through to the other side where suddenly it had a huge disproportionate ROI for them.
I see that it being the willingness to go down a path that not everybody's going down. And in fact, fewer people are going down because there's that lack of measurability. Like there's going to be rewards for essentially taking the contrarian option. That's how it is in investing. Like if you win big on a bet that everybody else is on the other side of, like, you're one of the biggest winners in that kind of pie that you're taking there. One question I have around this, I guess like the upside here is like, does it have to fit? Like, do you have to be a certain type of company or have a certain monetization strategy for this to kind of pay off? If it's going to be less measurable, if it's going to be smaller samples, one would assume that it would probably have to be a higher LTV purchase once a customer comes through, and that probably means B2B. So I'm guessing like this is maybe trickier to work in a B2C space, unless you're really good at getting contrarian opinions just like pumped out, like a Tim Ferriss or something like that.
Yeah, and this is something we think about a lot as well. Like there are, as you say, there are fundamentally different unit economics between a lot of different companies, and the function content plays is different. Having said that, I think even in like B2C, where maybe like the products are a lot more homogenous than they would be if you're comparing like a services agency to another services agency kind of thing, like the importance of brand and actually content that has a personality and is differentiated from other companies becomes more important. So even if, from that kind of acquisition strategy, even if maybe the numbers don't work out quite the way you'd expect, I think having a more recognizable brand is much more important. And that is something that is really served by content and having contrarian, interesting thought leadership content. So I think you can still make the case for it even in that situation.
It feels like it may be particularly important in already crowded spaces too, because now that you say it, I'm thinking about brands that I follow in the CPG or like D2C space, and especially the ones that are in food or nutrition or something like that. Like I often find the most successful ones tend to be the ones with founders or bloggers or somebody who's kind of a thought leader in the company who's put their opinion out there in this really interesting way. The first one that comes to mind is Dave Asprey in Bulletproof, and how he essentially built his entire business on like contrarian opinions around diet and like, basically going extremely keto and like putting like butter and MCT and stuff in your coffee. And that, got him on the news, and it got like all this PR buzz. And now he's got like a whole product line and a whole company based around this stuff. But it's like, you think of it because of that contrarian opinion, which is a form of content marketing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And one of the things I always talk to people about is the idea that the content strategy that we use at Animalz, we are a services agency in a very saturated industry, and it's not always the right strategy for other companies to follow because we are not a SaaS company. We're not in like legal or finance or whatever. So I like this idea of thinking about content marketing in terms of the maturity of your industry. There are some industries where, like HubSpot is a classic example, almost like it basically popularized content marketing, and the entire like marketing automation space is so laden with content now that anything you do has to stand out. Just differentiation is an absolute prerequisite to get any results. But the other end of the spectrum, you've got these slightly laggard industries, things where like a lot of the buying process is more offline. Maybe there are compliance issues or legal issues that make it a bit harder to create content in the way you just churn out content at a big SaaS company. And actually, because content marketing hasn't been used in those industries, you can do very basic, very foundational things and still get disproportionate results from it. Because there are some companies, some customers we work with where we don't practice what we preach in the sense of, we don't do loads of really contrarian thought leadership. We just do really well executed SEO, because that's still the right thing. Don't over engineer the solution if you don't have to.
I've talked about this. I had a former client that was in the cannabis space, and it's essentially like the early 2000s or late 90s there. So you just like plug and play, like pump keywords out. They don't have to be that great of quality. Domain rating was like 20 or something like that. So they barely had links, and they're already ranking for all these terms, and like product-led terms too. And it was amazing to see. But you could never do that in the MarTech space. Like if you had a CRM, if you had an email marketing tool, there's absolutely no way that would work. So there's almost this inverse correlation between like the creativity and innovation you need in a content strategy and sort of like the maturity of the industry as a whole. Or I don't know, actually, because sometimes when you have an industry that's like not even there yet, like a nascent one, like open source analytics or something like that, like you almost have to like form what you guys call movement first content to like get it on the board and educate people that it's a thing. So maybe there's this middle ground where it's like the marketers haven't come in yet. So you could just plug and play these basic ideas. I don't know. There does seem to be a landscape of different plays though, in terms of like how kind of creative you have to be.
I've been working on a blog post draft for about a year now. It's probably not going to see the light of day, but it was riffing on the idea of like 0 to 1, 1 to 0 kind of products, and the idea that most products are 1 to n. That's the terminology. So, people are familiar with the paradigm. They know what this type of software does, and your company maybe adds a new feature set or it differentiates in some minor way. In which case, like your playbook there is positioning yourself against the existing solution. People know what you are, and you can kind of playbook it and do many of the familiar things. But if you are a 0 to 1 company, your first thing to do is just, help people work out what the hell you are. What is the problem you solve? Where do you fit into the landscape of technology? And in a lot of cases, that is a fundamentally different proposition. You can't just do the ultimate guide to whatever product you are if nobody's heard of your product in the first place.
I think it's probably a harder place to be in as a content marketer, but probably a more fun one. I think that at CXL, we had kind of this problem. There was already conversion optimization, but there weren't really any like big blogs or like huge names that were kind of consolidating all the different ideas and like really creating the playbook for prioritization models, research models, all that stuff. So I did get a little taste of doing that at CXL, but I couldn't imagine, being at Content Marketing Institute or HubSpot, which nowadays, like I really like, sometimes talk a little smack on the content strategy, but like back in the day, like they were really pushing this boulder uphill to get content marketing even on the radar of anybody's radar, like let alone, the CMO or like whoever's making these decisions.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's where I guess this kind of category creation, coin concept aspect comes in. They were really good at, they defined a message and they stuck with it for years. They did a really good job at wrapping up in pithy terminology that people could easily remember. I've always been fascinated with HubSpot strategy, always, because my agency was one of the first HubSpot partners in the UK. So we were very invested in that ecosystem. We cared a lot about it. And it's interesting seeing this kind of ascent and then a slight fall where they become the butt of content marketing jokes. They're pumping out how to type a shrug emoji, just going after every article. Keyword. Yeah. So, and I actually know Clifford, who wrote that as well. It's fantastic. But even now, I see a lot of the stuff they're doing with like acquisition of the hustle and these new content properties. Seems like there's a little bit of innovation going on again, and it's the next thing is about to happen.
Well, that's what I was going to say. You can look at that as a leading indicator, or maybe not even a leading indicator. Maybe it's already the trend. But I think they pivot well, but pretty slowly, probably. But they're clearly hitting that ceiling in terms of like the search landscape. There's only so many keywords that actually are even arguably relevant to your industry. The shrug emoji is probably in the far periphery of that. But like then you start to really scrape the bottom of the barrel. Then you're writing articles that are like, 10 monthly search volume or something like that. And you're like, all right, is the ROI even here for these? So I do think like eventually you're kind of squeezed out by necessity to attempt new ways to garner attention and, essentially get people through the door.
Yeah. I guess, kudos to HubSpot for even being able to do that. I can't imagine any company literally dominating the search landscape the way they did. Yeah, blows my mind.
It is amazing. And it was such a privilege. Like when I worked at HubSpot, like you just had this immediate form of leverage where you're like, hey, we're launching something. Oh, let's write a blog post. We'll rank number 1 tomorrow. This is amazing. Yeah, and that showed me, honestly, like outside of even the strategic components, just the true value of like playing the long game of content in that like you don't have this like, I don't know, it's like faucet that you have to turn on and off or something like that, like paid ads. You truly have this like billboard essentially in the center of town no matter how you want to use it, you essentially have all this leverage and kind of command of attention already in place, and you've built it over time. So it's very difficult to usurp that as another competitor would.
That was one of the ways I always used to frame content to customers was its optionality for the future, especially search content. Even if you don't necessarily need this volume coming to you right now, having it a year or 2 years from now, when you suddenly want to do a big push, you're going to launch a new feature, it's so useful to have. And obviously HubSpot had that in spades.
We would use it for interesting purposes too. Like there's obviously the direct attribution of like, getting somebody onto an email list or signing up for an ebook, or in HubSpot's case, on my team, the freemium team, getting a freemium acquisition user coming in. But eventually, like we realized we had all this leverage in the form of like, all right, we've got all this attention and we write about all these different topics. So why don't we use this to form partnerships wherein we can actually like use somebody else's audience as well? So that's where kind of the surround sound strategy came in, where we would try to dominate the whole search results page for a given like product-led keyword, best live chat software. We started partnering with other companies that would rank for those pages and, offer them placements on given pages on HubSpot's blog. But it's like you get all these creative avenues that like I never thought of that before. Like I saw the opportunity in front of me because we already had the attention and like all these different articles that ranked, but it was a super effective form of leverage for those partnerships.
I love that. It's such a lateral move. When everyone else is like worrying about keyword cannibalization, HubSpot was like, let's just get all the keywords in some capacity.
Well, we looked at it like window shopping. You're a searcher, you're looking for best CRM software, something like that. If you're searching for a keyword like that, you don't necessarily have your mind made up. You're trying to see what other people think is the best one. So I thought about it in analogous form of somebody at a cocktail party who's like, what books have you read recently? And if one person says Sapiens and the rest says other random things, like you might check out Sapiens. It's at least on your radar. Now you know about it. You went 0 to 1. But if every person in that group was like, holy shit, you got to check out Sapiens, it was the best book I've ever read, then you're probably going to go check out Sapiens. So we kind of looked at that as analogous to like when you're number one position on every listicle and every G2 and every Capterra, people are like, wow, I kind of got to check out HubSpot. It seems like it's pretty popular.
I love that surround sound you said as well. Have you written an article about that? Because that is
I did. Yeah, that was one of my best coin turns. Honestly, like that's the one that probably got the most legs. And
I love that.
It's on HubSpot's blog. They've got a whole series about it. We've actually thought about doing more of that work with our agency, but it's very difficult to scale out because HubSpot has this innate advantage. Like I was saying, if you're starting out with a blog from scratch, it's really difficult to convince people to put you on those listicles unless you have something you can trade them, or at least implicitly, like you have some value for them as well. So we're still thinking through that, but I love the concept, and it's a super effective direct attribution channel too. Like you can directly, track these things.
Yeah.
I want to switch it up. You write novels. You write fiction as well.
I do. Yeah, I do indeed. I actually just finished drafting the second book I'm going to publish.
When did you, well, first off, like when did you write your first book? When did you get into this? When did you first sit down to write fiction? And the second question is, how do you find time?
So I think so many people that go into content marketing, like they want to be authors at heart. At least half the people I talk to, they've always held this deep-seated aspiration to write books and get paid for it. And I think, early in my career, I realized that the writing boring content for companies I didn't really care about was probably going to make me more money than trying to write fiction and become this like starved, penniless author. So that was the direction I went.
But did you always want to be a fiction author? Was that always sort of like an interest of yours, even growing up?
Yeah, I think probably. Yeah, I was really good at writing at school, but anything I did at school kind of was tainted by the poison of school, I think. So I fell out of love with it for a few years, but that's always been like an undercurrent, always been a thread that I've been interested in. And the thing that made me finally actually like sit up and do it was just before I joined Animalz, I was between jobs and I had a bit of an existential crisis. And I thought, if I died tomorrow, like what do I want to have done? And one of those things was just writing that damn book that I've been thinking about for years. So I was just immensely practical about how I would do it. I sat down and defined what is a book. In my case, 50,000 words is the shortest it can be without being, still be a novel. Anything less than that is like a novella. So 50,000 words.
How many pages is that? Like 150, 200?
Yeah, like 157, I think it comes out on the
Mm-hmm.
Kindle or something. So it's short. It's a short book, but it's still a book. No one can
Mm-hmm.
take that away from me. I thought, what's the simplest structure I can use? Just like an end-to-end narrative following one character, basically trying to make life as simple for myself as possible. And um, I started writing a bunch of short stories because I didn't know what the hell I wanted to write as a book. And you do enough of those, and a few themes, a few ideas kind of cropped up that were universal across all of them. And I did that to the point where I thought, actually, yeah, there's an entire book composed of these short stories if I can just connect them together. So yeah, I already had a blog and an audience that was interested in post-apocalyptic fictions through a completely different side project, and I kind of meshed those two together to give me the direction and the means of executing it.
How did you use prompts for the short stories, or how did you go about that process?
The same way I think about ideas for our blog, I guess, just trying to absorb, any scenes from a film I watched that I really liked, or reading lots of fiction, or even, concepts from non-fiction that were interesting. And even today, like I browse Reddit and I read things about. There was a video of like somebody storing a gun underground in a barrel of oil for 15 years. Totally random thing I came across, but I thought that's kind of interesting. Like if you wanted to store that for so long, you'd have to think about that. Just these little like bits of technology, these little snippets that you can blow up into at least a scene. And having one scene to write that's interesting, that can be the start of a novel or a short story or anything you like.
Yeah, it is interesting. I'm feeling this understanding emerge where it does seem like you're a pattern connector of sorts. You have a bunch of ideas and a bunch of different areas of experience, and you're able to kind of synthesize those and create like a 1+1 = 3. Like you take an idea from here, take an idea from here, and it ends up being something on its own, like its own thing.
I think there are probably only two things I'm actually good at. And one of them is trying to make connections between seemingly unrelated stuff. And the other thing is just practicing something for a really long time, getting down to like the rote mechanical part of something and just doing it over and over again. But yeah, you combine those two together and it seems to be pretty useful.
How do you practice writing? Do you get feedback? Do you have accountability groups, or do you just do it solo and then kind of like emerge and publish this thing and get the feedback at that point?
I kind of reached a point where I realized I wasn't interested in feedback. I started trying to do that because that's the kind of common knowledge, you want to talk to other people and get their feedback and stuff. But I found I didn't really care what they thought, to be honest. I had a vision for it. I was writing this for myself. And I think a lot of the time, if you write something that you enjoy and you care about, there will be an audience out there that appreciates it in the same way that you do. So actually, yeah, totally self-centered, no input whatsoever, just publish it. As long as I'm happy with it, that's the bar I have to hit.
I think that's badass. Yeah. I love the concept of feedback, especially if I am truly trying to like put my nose to the grindstone and get better at something, in forms of like, if I'm doing a martial art or something like that, it makes total sense. And you're going to get natural feedback from the environment. But there's certain things where I'm the same way. And that's with music for me. I don't want to make it an arduous process. I don't want it to be difficult or uninteresting, or I don't want to feel like I'm, working. I want it to be fun, because like there's so much friction with it in the first place. Like I just want to make it the easiest possible thing for me to do. And it sounds like writing, at least like this fiction, is a creative outlet in that same way, where it's a very difficult thing, obviously, to put a book together, but it's probably very rewarding. So you don't want to put undue kind of like obstacles just for the sake of having obstacles, where you're kind of like sharpening the sword all the time.
Yeah, totally. And I've had loads and loads of feedback and input, and I've learned loads about writing generally from my team, from my career. So I get feedback on the mechanical part of writing all the time, and that obviously funnels into writing fiction. But in terms of what I write and how I write it, yeah, that's pure me. Nobody else gets any say over that bit, and I'm going to jealously guard that forever.
That's awesome. A question on process. So there's this framework. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's like plotters and pantsers. Heard of this one?
I've not. No, I've come across architects and gardeners. I don't know if that's a similar dichotomy.
Probably similar. I'm not sure the architects and gardeners, but the plotter and pantser is like if you're writing fiction, it's primarily used for fiction, but it could be, a metaphor for anything. But a plotter is somebody who sits down, maps the whole thing out meticulously, and acts according to the plan. And then a pantser flies by the seat of their pants. They want to build a building, right? A skyscraper, and they just do one brick at a time until that sucker's up in the sky, and they can point to it and be like, I did that. But they don't actually have a plan for what it's going to look like before they do so. Is that similar to architecture and gardening?
Yeah, exactly the same framework, just slightly different way of thinking about it. I was thinking about this, and I'm not sure I think that's a helpful framework. I don't think that's a helpful dichotomy, actually.
No?
Because content marketing is trying to be creative on a schedule. And the only thing I found that's, helps people do that predictably and consistently is process, is outlining content and trying to guardrail what you're writing as much as possible. But I think the key thing to do is limit just how much you plan and plot. So you want to get the bare bones in: start point, ending point. Maybe there's like a key thing you want to hit, so that if you do those three things, it is functional. It achieves the basic goal you want to do. But in terms of how you get between those points, the sky's the limit kind of thing. So that's how I try and approach all my writing, really. Have a couple of key milestones that you want to hit, but then let yourself have the freedom and creativity amongst that to, wander away from it for a little bit, add new stuff in, deviate a little bit, because otherwise it's just not fun to do.
So how does that functionally work with a novel where you've got to plan multiple plot points and character arcs? Like, do you map that out and sort of like, all right, I'm going to write a hero's journey. This is going to be the main character, and I know this is the climax, and I know this is the ending. Like those kind of like main storyboard points, or how do you define those boundaries and those guardrails on the kind of the plotter side of things before you begin to just improv and play jazz?
Yeah. So I had a really clear starting point, really clear ending point, and maybe say like two things I wanted to hit in the middle. Maybe there's like an overarching theme I want to pull out lots. And then that's literally it. I'm quite granular in terms of how I outline. So I've divided my 50,000 words into 10 chapters, roughly 5,000 words a piece, with say like there'll be 3 events within each one. What those events are, it kind of comes along as I'm writing, but I know roughly that's the right cadence, that's the right feel for it. If somebody reads that, it will feel something similar to a story they've read. So I guess that structurally, I know what it's going to look like, but the actual events themselves are totally unplanned until I get to it. Because as you write, you discover stuff, you think, you get into the mindset of a character, they respond to things you've set up previously, and it does feel like it's kind of emerging and pouring out of you.
Has there ever been a point where, a character's arc or like a plot point surprised you as you wrote it? You look back and you're like, whoa, I don't know where that came from. That was interesting. Don't know if I could have planned that ahead of time.
There's this one character in my book, he's called Serdan, and all the others I find it's, I have to think about it. I have to be deliberate about writing them. This dude just writes himself. I think maybe there's like some deep repression within me and it's just him manifesting on my like wild, sides. But yeah, he always seems to know what he's doing without any like input from me, which is pretty fun. I enjoy writing his stuff.
Yeah, that sounds natural. It sounds like you just organically come out with plot points and dialogue from this guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Have you found that there's any has your writing fiction, has that influenced how you look at content marketing or your skills therein, or vice versa? Like, has content marketing helped you approach writing fiction in a way that you think is different from how most people look at it?
Yeah, probably. I think I've taken my love of structure from content and applied that to fiction, and the storytelling, the importance of, even if nothing happens in a scene, that scene being interesting and fun to read, applying that to content as well. So one of the things I do in a lot of our articles these days is open up with just like a really compelling, interesting narrative story that sets up some metaphor that's useful for the rest of the article, but it's just fun to read. The last article we published starts with an anecdote about like the world's greatest shark fisherman, and uses that to set up an article about how to write a good introduction. And that's something I think, comes classically from fiction.
I love sprinkling in elements like that. I don't know where I got this idea, but I think it was just boredom. Like, I think it was a CXL, and I didn't want to just write these like formulaic kind of like SEO driven articles. Granted, that wasn't what we were supposed to do. But, after writing all these like 2 per week or something like that, I'm like, I'm just going to sprinkle in some like little Easter eggs, some inside jokes. Because Chanel Mullen and I, we would kind of edit each other's articles when we both worked there. So I would love when I would pass her an article and she would, respond with feedback of just like laughing. Like I would just bury these little comic things that were very, very difficult to parse out if you were just like reading it from like a, searcher's perspective. But like if you kind of knew where I was going, like it would be fun to add those little elements. And I think that made it probably more fun to read, but definitely more fun to write.
One of the best articles on our blog, written by Katie, who's our director of sales, and it was about thought leadership, and she knows so much about that topic. And she delivered me a first draft that was 6,000 words, and it was packed full of like dozens of memes that she'd added to it. And I ended up cutting like maybe 80% of those, but even the 20% of the memes and jokes that left in there, it's just fun. It's just interesting. And it wasn't just like belabored and not relevant to it. It was stuff that did help you understand the article in a more deeper, granular way. So memes are a powerful like vector of communication, I think.
100%. That's a skill that I need to get better at. Shit posting and Twitter memes. Like I feel like that's a very powerful way to move the industry now. But I do with this content, like when you're having fun writing it, like you mentioned your character that just seems to like speak naturally, and you come up with things just like without even thinking about it, without even planning. I feel that when I write content sometimes, maybe 90% of the time, because I mostly write for my own blog now, and it's, you know, not like necessarily like I don't have to do it, right? But then if I do feel like I have to write a piece, sometimes for Omniscient, if it's like very, you know, like sales enablement focused, I feel belabored, right? Like it's a harder article to write. I spend way more time researching and second guessing myself. And I don't know the difference because I don't have like a blind taste test here, but I wonder which one is better or more interesting or more fun to read and more useful from the reader's perspective. I don't know the answer. It seems, you know, like logically, I would just think the easier one for me to write, but who knows? Maybe there's like something to the fact that you're like belabored and really putting, you know, emphasis on every detail versus just stream of conscious writing it.
Yeah, I always feel the same way. I'm very lucky that I get to write about content marketing as a content marketer because I don't have to stress that hard about it. It's just subject matter that I know. It's so much harder when you have to precursor everything with hours of research. And it probably does manifest in the quality and the experience of the person on the other end as well.
I would imagine because you do have more of a like the system one versus system two brain. So your system one takes over. You don't have to think about every detail as much. That leaves you additional mental space to like put in those little sprinkles of personality, the little details, the videos, the memes, et cetera, that make it like that cherry on top, right? Like the same article, but then you just have that little extra endurance for those things. Do you have, like, you mentioned the plotting versus pantsing in fiction and how you have like guardrails there. Do you find that there's elements that you can't remove in terms of process or guardrails from the content marketing process? And which ones you can do a little bit more pantsing and a little bit more improv?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do quite often like try different styles for the Animalz blog. Quite a lot of what we do, we use like different formulae and frameworks for structuring it. So like the idea of MISI, where content should be mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. The idea that whenever you write an article, it should cover the entire breadth of a topic, but not overlap with anything, not duplicate itself, that kind of thing. And that necessitates like a really meticulous, rigid outlining structure, and you have to plot it absolutely to death. But looking back over lots of Jimmy's articles, he was not that kind of writer. He was very much like off the cuff. What is he thinking? Get a single draft done in between sales calls. And quite often the results of that content were better in some cases as well. It was a little bit more binary. It would either do nothing or it'd be a great success as opposed to, you know, more predictable middling success, I think. So I do that as well. Sometimes if I just have an opinion, I'll try and crank it out in 800 words and hit publish and properly like seat of the pants it.
That's cool. It's interesting. I'm trying to do that much more myself. And that's why I ask is like, typically I've had more of an outline process with the content creation, but now I'm trying to like reduce the barriers of entry and reduce the friction that it takes to get content done, just because it's one of those things that slides on the back burner, right? Like you've got all these different things to do. So I'm trying to do more of the stream of conscious style, especially with regards to thought leadership. But I think there's this difficult clash when it comes to perfectionism versus like prolificness, whatever that word would be, right? Like actually just dumping things out there and seeing what the response is versus like internally editing and judging every piece of what you've written before the audience gets a chance to do so.
I'd be curious to know what you think, but I do kind of think that being prolific is probably more important than being a perfectionist. I'm sure lots of people on my team would disagree with me, but that's probably my gut instinct.
I think so too. I think sometimes with perfectionism, you sort of like iron out all the interesting quirks and personality that would have had people respond more favorably in the first place. And I actually think that may be a contrarian opinion of mine is when people care too much about style, whether it's like something, you know, formal like AP style or like whatever the kind of structure and grammar is. I think that actually like removes or it takes more energy away from the writer and the editor from the actual themes and the content itself. So I think that sometimes you actually end up with not only less useful content, but much less interesting, much less personality-filled content. In fact, that's why I like reading people like Nassim Taleb. He's got this idiosyncratic, like just ironclad will when it comes to like his editors, and he just won't budge. You know, he's like, this is how I wrote it. This is how it stays. This is how it's published. And I love that. It's like you hear his voice when you're reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, using some style guide or whatever, it enhances content up to a point where then the rigid adherence to it actually puts a barrier between you and the reader. You do need these little foibles and quirks of content to actually feel like you're talking to somebody and it's an actual like lived experience you're having.
100%. Do you look at yourself as more of a writer or more of a marketer? And like, if one or the other, what's the difference that you perceive in between those two worlds?
So I literally just published an article on this exact topic. I think it's called "You're a Content Marketer, Not Just a Writer." I wrote that basically because one of the self-limiting beliefs I see a lot of content marketers have is that they love being writers and they care about being writers, and they are so reluctant to lose that identity that they don't embrace the full breadth of skills and abilities and experiences that are necessary to be a great marketer. Because writing is such an important facet of content marketing, but it's not the only one. And I kind of think as well that what you were saying about Nassim Taleb and things not being too polished, great ideas can survive bad writing, but bad ideas will not be lifted up by great writing. If the idea is sound and you've thought through it and it's a great idea, even if you're a terrible writer, you can still get great results from it. But having said that, I'm never going to lose that part of me that feels like a writer. I think writing is just, I view it as like applied problem solving. Even writing an article for a customer, you have this desirable end state, you have the constraint of a keyword that you have to hit and like distribution channels, and it's up to you to connect those things and make them function. And yeah, I love that. I've always enjoyed that aspect of content marketing. It's always felt like this creative problem solving process. So even though I wax lyrical about all these other skills that are needed, probably am still a writer at heart.
That's exactly how I feel. It's like you understand that you need CRO skills, you need some paid acquisition, maybe if you're director of marketing, if you're trying to get customers, like there's all these various areas. So you like apply the lens of like a marketer in order to solve problems that are going to get you paid more. And I think that's important because if you're just a writer, it's not necessarily easy to command like high salaries. Like you need to do the things that people value. Yeah. But I would say like I'm myself, like I would look at myself much more like a writer than a marketer, simply because I've never looked at myself as a marketer. In the business context, I've always thought like I'm more of a problem solver or like a kind of builder of sorts. But I've always found marketing to be an interesting problem solving domain, right? Because it blends the creative with the scientific. But I've never looked at myself as like I'm an SEO or I'm like a CRO person. It's always been something more fundamental. And I think writing, communication in general is probably like a more like personally identifiable part by which I kind of like solve problems.
Yeah, I'm totally the same. Maybe even shed content marketing in a heartbeat if there was another domain that I could get that same kind of problem solving thrill through doing if that opportunity came to me. Now, I'm not wedded to being a marketer for the rest of my life. That's not why I get out of bed in the morning.
Absolutely. So you play music as well, guitar?
Yeah. I've been playing guitar since I was maybe like 15, I think.
What got you into that?
I love listening to a band called The Darkness. They're like British rockers, basically, like amazing falsetto vocals.
I believe in a thing called love.
Yeah, spot on. Exactly. I don't know. I just loved watching them play guitar. I bought like the worst guitar money could buy on eBay using all of the little pocket money I had available to me. And I spent my lonely teenage years locked up in my bedroom practicing guitar for like 5 hours a day.
And now you're working with a band. Am I right?
Yeah. We've reached a point in history where anyone can create and publish anything they like. So actually just put our first single out and I'm amazed at how legitimate it sounds. It actually sounds like music.
Did you guys record it all yourselves or did you hire somebody to engineer and produce it or?
Largely all ourselves. Yeah. My
like Logic Pro or something like that.
Yeah, my friend Steve is a amazing producer as well as an amazing musician, and he's just absolutely like reveled in the production element of it as well, which, as it turns out, is so hard and so complicated.
It is, yeah. I've tried to go down that rabbit hole. It's very technical, and the software. I actually think like this is a big business opportunity. Well, it depends because who knows what the market size is, but the software is pretty hard to use. and it's not collaborative. Like you can't really like share files and like easily do like version control like you could a Google Doc. So I feel like there is an opportunity there because I also would love to record stuff on my own, but I'm stuck with GarageBand and like just a shitty understanding of like how to use it.
Oh yeah, build like the Figma of music production.
I think that would be amazing.
Live, yeah.
The Canva or something like that. Like give me like the easy version where I can actually put together like highly polished stuff. So have you, was this the first band that you've worked with, or were you ever kind of in a band before?
Yeah, first band. I was very much like a bedroom guitar player. I got really, really good at the technical aspect of playing guitar, but because I was self-taught, I never bothered learning any music theory. So the last couple of years, like I tried to play in a few bands. I realized there was this gulf of communication between us that even though I was like technically very proficient, I just didn't speak their language. So I was lucky enough to find a couple of friends that were interested in the band, and I've been using that as a motivator to learn music theory and try and like bridge that gap a little bit as well.
Do you write music as well, or what's your process in terms of like putting together the songs? Like you said, you put out the single.
Yeah. So it's incredibly collaborative. Like I've written some of the vocal melodies. A few of the songs I've written entirely myself from scratch. Others I've literally put in like 2 notes of guitar, and the other band members have just run with it.
So how do you look at the difference in the creative process, or like how you come up with an idea to like execution in these different worlds? Because you've got content marketing, you've got writing fiction, and you've got writing music. Is there a difference? Do you look at them all as kind of the same thing, or how do you approach each of those creative problems?
It honestly just feels like the same process applied to different domains, I think. Having a vast collection of inputs for whatever you're interested in. I listen to music for dozens of hours a day because I work to it, I weightlift to it. I read all the books in the world, content marketing, I'm reading and writing all the time. All of that is it's fodder for you to then pass and process and use in whatever domain you're going to do. And then the other component is literally just the rote mechanical practice of it, finding like the core skill set you want to get better at and doing it again and again and again. Guitar, that's easy because it's a mechanical thing to do. Writing, you write lots and you reflect on that writing. Probably those two same processes in everything I do and just slightly different applications of them.
Yeah, it sounds like, well, in both of these areas, writing and guitar, it sounds like you're an action-based learner. You're going and practicing, not necessarily just reading all about like how to write, all the books on like, Stephen King, he wrote one, there's like the masterclass, like there is some component that you can learn from that, but it sounds like you're much more of a doer, like dive in the deep end of the pool and figure out how to swim. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And then read the books afterwards to contextualize the experience you've had and realize that other people have struggled through the same thing you just struggled through.
So when you began guitar, did you just go and try to learn a bunch of songs that you enjoyed listening to, or what was your process initially?
The very first things I ever tried to learn were the guitar solos from Bohemian Rhapsody and Sweet Child of Mine.
Oh, that's not a great place to start.
Absolutely not. And with hindsight, like I thought I'd managed to nail it after like 3 months of playing. And I can't imagine how absolutely atrocious that would have been. But that was the thing that appealed to me. I've always been interested in what is the hardest thing I can learn. Try and do that. And then the next time you do something that's less hard, it'll be so much easier in the process.
It kind of does. It lets you know like where you can hope to achieve, as long as you don't enter it like expecting to master that Bohemian Rhapsody solo on day one, or like, if you're in CrossFit, like if you do like whatever, like a clean jerk split, whatever, like crazy Olympic lift, like you can look at that and be like, all right, that's where I'm going to be. But I feel like if you actually expect to like master that on day one, you're just going to be disillusioned and dejected after you're like, I could barely even press my finger down without my finger hurting today,
Yeah, and I definitely did go into all of these pursuits with like totally naive expectations. But as long as you learn what's realistic and you find small moments of joy in even like the most simple of successes, I think.
I think the way you do it, you probably learn a lot quicker as well. I think you force yourself out of your comfort zone initially instead of like, wearing the floaties, putting the training wheels on right away. I did the same thing when I was at CXL with learning A/B testing. I think this is an area that I actually think about a lot, is like the meta learning and like how to learn new skills and how to get better quickly at things. And at CXL, I would dive in and like talk to the most advanced like data science experts and like read fucking textbooks on like how to do this. And like, I wasn't reading the Neil Patel blog posts, and it took me like, I would have to read the same article like 6, 7, 8 times and like just really grok every point, and then email different people to ask them to explain it to me like I'm 5. But I do feel like through that process, I was ironed out into a more effective, sophisticated, just like more advanced thinker in that area. And I think the same is true when you look at guitar or something like that. When you aim yourself up to these like high expectations, you're not going to get it right away, but at least you're going to understand where you could go. And then you're not necessarily going to be anchored down by playing like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star for the first year of your guitar playing career.
Yeah. And lots of people ask me, what are the best content marketing books to read? And every time I just say, don't read content marketing books. They're always so foundational. They share the same kind of truisms. Go and find something that's adjacent to it. As long as you have a bare understanding of content, you'll gain more from other disciplines and try and apply that yourself to content. Because otherwise, if everyone's reading the same stuff, practicing the same way, you're going to end up with like the most homogenous group of people doing exactly the same stuff.
I find that books in these subjects always brush over like the underlying theory and the underlying principles, and they kind of like do surface level tactics too. So you do end up with a lot of copycat content for that reason. And not just in content. There's books in all kinds of like marketing subjects. Anything that you feel like you're always behind on, when you get that FOMO, that like constant hamster wheel where you're like, oh, there's always new tactics out there, whatever. I don't want to read books about those because I feel like they're never up to date fully. And you're just like you're never fully going to reach that point. So I always opt for the foundational stuff as well.
One of my aspirations is to write like an evergreen content marketing book, something that is just all these like universal principles that underpin it, that will never go out of date, that will always be useful. That's maybe like a bit too much of a stretch goal, but that would be cool. That would be a cool thing.
We've thought about it because we really index on this idea of content strategy. And like before you ever write content, like people talk about like whether it's like content promotion versus like production, doesn't matter if your strategy is wrong. So we've talked a lot about this idea of like doing the foundational customer research, the SWOT analyses, the competitive stuff, and getting in place like a strategy that you yourself, your company can like execute on and rely on your strengths and exploit the shit out of those. And then kind of like, flank other competitors in their areas of weakness. But this idea of content strategy, you can then pull like all these ideas from, economics, evolutionary biology. Like there's so many different kind of like fundamental things you could put in. But every time I think about this project, I just get overwhelmed with the thought of writing a book and like trying to make it a universal evergreen thing, because I think it's really difficult to mess those things up versus like a tactical, like here's what's awesome today thing. Like you could just go do a bunch of interviews and almost like paste it together,
Yeah, totally agree with that. Yeah, it's an intimidating prospect.
So in your career, do you have like who are you chasing? What's the long game for you? Like where are you looking at the next couple of years?
Yeah, I have a really hard time answering that. I have no idea. The one thing my boss Devin always says to me is that she knows that I get bored very quickly. I like learning. I like being exposed to new problems. I like helping across every facet of a company. So I have no idea what that looks like. Literally no idea. But I didn't think I'd be director of marketing now. I didn't think I'd even be a content marketer. I'll just go wherever it keeps me interested, and hopefully wherever I can do a bit of writing from time to time as well.
Is there a path right now that you're or like a rabbit hole that you're down in terms of like what you're interested in or what you're learning currently?
I'm kind of getting a little bit of a resurgence back into weightlifting again. Like it comes back in peaks and troughs, and I kind of opt in and out of what I'm interested. Professionally, not even sure really. Yeah, maybe doubling down a bit on like the thought leadership aspect. That's I've come from such a world of SEO that exploring this world of content that doesn't have that safety net is super interesting to me. How can you make predictably successful, interesting content that doesn't use keywords? So learning as much as I can about that, learning from like media publications and so on.
Do you have any particular goals or pursuits with weightlifting? Are you trying to like bulk or like gain strength or cut, or how are you thinking about that?
My next goal is a 140 kilogram bench press. That's the one I want to tick off, like lifetime goal. I managed to do 132.5 before my little boy was born in December, and understandably becoming a parent, like just totally trashed my lifting routine. So I'm just getting back into it now.
That's awesome though. I'm also kind of in this path of like weightlifting and fitness right now, but I'm cutting. So I'm trying to like get shredded right now. It's so the worst. Oh my God.
I just never bother with that.
Well, I'm doing it once. Like all I want to do is like hit this point and like show to myself that I can do it, show to my friends that I can do it. But like you hit this last point, like it's actually pretty easy to do. Like after you do a bulk and like if you gain a little muscle, like your metabolism's much better. So for the first couple months when you cut, it's actually pretty simple. But then the last part, that last 5 or 10%, which is true in literally any pursuit, it is so much more difficult. If you have like one extra glass of wine, or like if you just veer off the path a little bit, like you ruin your progress for like a week, and it's so fickle and so frustrating. So I much prefer the strength, the goals that you're working on. It's way more fun.
Absolutely. I'd never even bother trying diet anymore. It's just so harrowing and sad. I just try and up my exercise intake to a point where I'm just gaining weight slowly.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's cool. I'm going to have to jump here, but this was super fun. Did you want to say any last words, anything that you didn't bring up that you would want to talk about, or otherwise you could just mention, maybe where you can find your work online or where people can follow you?
Yeah, the only thing I will say, I've been doing a few podcast interviews, and this has been the most fun. It's nice to have an active participant in the conversation and learn a little bit about you as well. So really appreciate that. In terms of where people can find stuff, Animalz blog, probably the best place to go, animalz.co/blog. Generally try and publish something like once a week about the cutting edge of content marketing. What's changing? What should people care about? How can you get better at your craft? How can you think a little bit smarter? And I'm on Twitter all the time, thinking_slow. I can't help but tweet.
Is the thinking_slow, is that related to the Daniel Kahneman book?
Absolutely is, yeah. Aspirational state, yeah.
That's awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I'll let you jump to your call.